Oh, this is Mike from Everybody Hates Cleveland. We're going to drop a little podcast here with John Grimm, the attendant at Guild DeWalters on Twitter. If you haven't followed him, ultimately the snarkiest, most insightful, and most inane references, if not inane, most deep references on Twitter. So we have John Grimm on, and we're going to just kind of talk about the Indians' offseason, things they should have done, things they will do, and you perhaps will be in an existential crisis about where we are now, where we're going, where we've been, and what it all means. So I think the first question is, how much leeway do we feel like the Indians actually have financially this season, um, and how much leeway is limited by the limitations of the 2017 and 2018 budgets?
Yeah, let's be clear. They are inane references. They are completely inane. They are not deep. Let's not make any mistakes about that. As to what extent they can actually make moves in 2016, I think Bastion's number was 10 to 15, but I find that pretty puzzling because they're at 65 million right now, and what were they at last year? 85? Is that right?
Yeah, they started at 85, which I think this is part of the conversation that's interesting to me. Where they actually ended and when the money is being exchanged with Atlanta has a lot of implications
Mhm.
that we don't understand. It seems to me like they're using that as a sword, perhaps to avoid expenditure or because the two front offices are trying to protect each other in terms of the money. But I think that deal seems dangerous to me in that it provides this shelter for limited expenditure, but we don't really actually know when money changed hands or what the cash flow looks like. Is that fair?
Yeah, the concept of the Atlanta money being a black box is a really effective weapon, I think. Now, like, there's definitely a temptation to go the Seal Dolan's cheap route, but it may not be totally wrong in this case, because the baseline MLB expense, I would think, is probably like what 120, 110 million.
I
Uh,
think that's about, yeah.
I mean, for most MLB teams, it's not what it was 10 years ago. And payrolls for Cleveland are. They haven't increased as much as the rest of the league. And that I find interesting. Uh, I mean, if most of the money changed hands last year, then I, the 10 million listed for on Cott's baseball contract brought to you by Baseball Prospectus, those numbers would be interesting. But if they're just going to use that as a blanket number to prevent them from getting to 85 million, then it's a little difficult. Now, the one thing that I will say is that if they are planning to make it like 75 million next year, 85 the following year, 95 in 2018, then that makes a little bit more sense. But if they're just going to use this as a black box in order to keep them at their current payroll or near their current payroll, then I don't know. I can't really get behind that.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things you bring up is these sort of rolling payrolls. And I think we see them a lot in small markets. Tampa Bay has done them. I think if you look
Yeah.
at Kansas City, they've really ramped up their payroll in the last 2 or 3 years as their core moved into its kind of peak to end peak seasons. It seems like if there's a season to ramp up your payroll, it's going to be when, Carrasco, Kluber and those sorts, even Brantley, Kipnis, and Gomes to a lesser extent are in their mid to late 20s. Even I think Kluber's 30 now. This seems like it would be a time to ramp that number up, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I think that's why the Cubs did what they did. I'm not comparing the Indians to the Cubs because Chicago is not Cleveland, the more you know. But the general strategy the Cubs are pursuing, that is to say, going after big free agents while you have a bunch of cheap pre-arb guys, as well as Rizzo's excellent contract, that is pretty much the ideal way to take advantage of young talent. And like going forward, like the projections that the Indians payroll would be at 100 million, at 105 million, if they manage to like make a big signing this offseason and then dealt with the escalating salaries in 2016, 17, 18, etc. I would be more amenable to that, but for the fact that most of these contracts are still going to have large positive trade values, even when Kipnis is making something like $10 million a year. It just won't be all that valuable to Cleveland because, hard resource cap.
That's very interesting. So, yeah, I think probably my looking at 2017 and 2018 as a barrier financially is foolish, in that you can move most of these contracts. Although hopefully, to me, Kipnis is a really interesting guy that could be touched on at another point. But Kipnis seems like, especially with the Indians' limitations long term, it obviously has to do with how you value Jose Ramirez and how you value other players. But I guess this is segueing into the offseason a little bit, and we'll come back around, I promise. But one of the interesting rumors to me has been the amount at which the Indians have been tied to Joe Panik, from the San Francisco Giants. Multiple times with different starters, the deal has focused around Joe Panik, one of them being a rumored deal of Belt and Panik for Carrasco, and another Panik plus multiple minor league assets for Salazar.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of curious as to whether the implication is Panik moves to third, the implication is Kipnis moves to left, or the implication is that you turn around Kipnis somewhere else. So what are your thoughts on that?
That is very interesting because Panik last year was excellent. He was like, aside from the fact that he didn't play more than 100 games, he was completely elite at second base. He was a 4-win player, and he has a ton of team control left. And while his minor league numbers suggest that the 138 WRC plus that he posted was not the realist, nevertheless, like, he still has a 3-win projection for 2016. Is still 25, and if they wanted, I don't totally know how they would move things around though. So moving positions seems like it's easy, but I also am really kind of hesitant about that, particularly given what happened with Santana as he moved to third.
Yeah, I expect that Chisenhall's provided us with a certain amount of hubris regarding position changes that likely is going to fail us in the near future. But I think Kipnis to me is someone who it really depends philosophically where you think the Indians are going. But Kipnis is someone to me. Kipnis is someone who has significant injury history, or at least not insignificant injury history. It's a high use position. He's someone also who seems to be a ultimately high use player. And I don't know. I think at his age, he's moving to the end of his 20s with a really good contract. It seems like he's someone who is actually movable, except for they have this window where they'd like to compete, so he's not movable. But I guess one interesting thing to me is perhaps could it be an outfield move for Kipnis? I mean, this is someone who second base is a position with a lot of wear and tear. Kipnis hasn't been able to stay that healthy. He's a former college outfielder. That's where he was drafted, and he's moved to the infield. I mean, is this a situation where Panik would be a move to second, and Kipnis would be moved to the outfield because they have a reason to? Whereas right now, pushing Kipnis to the outfield for Jose Ramirez is a tough sell, as much as we love Jose Ramirez.
Yes, Jose Ramirez seems like the more natural outfield fit. I mean, I know that Jason Kipnis played there, and I know that Jose Ramirez hasn't yet. Well, I think he had some games in AAA last year, but minimal experience, whatever. On the other hand, so did Chisenhall. Point being, Jose Ramirez, he is in the works for the outfield next year, and while having Jason Panik or having Panik at second base would be excellent. I don't know, unless you're planning to play Jose Ramirez in center, Kipnis in right. And we're moving Chisenhall back to third in this scenario? Or
Very
are we just
possible.
okay?
Very possible.
Because I don't trust Urshela at all, and while I don't trust Chisenhall at third either, well, I guess you could platoon the two. I don't know. I don't trust moving Kipnis to the outfield because I feel like that's just something of a deadweight loss. In that he's not going to be as good an outfielder as he is passable a second baseman right now. So the panic trade, I understand the concept of, hey, let's add wins somehow. But the panic fit is a kind of tough sell to me just because of that deadweight loss that I think is probably going to happen if you move Kipnis to the outfield.
Yeah, and obviously, I think there are different routes. I very well think that they actually could be really prioritizing third base right now. I think that's why Panic could be in the mix. I know Panic was a college shortstop. Usually, guys who played college short are at least capable at third, or teams think they can be at least capable at third. So I could definitely see that it's more likely that Panic would be acquired for the purpose of upgrading third base, a la the Indians' interest in Frazier as well. So I suppose with that segue to the name, Todd Frazier, we should now discuss Todd Frazier and potential deals that could be made to acquire Todd Frazier. So he has 2 years left on his contract. He's in a very favorable ballpark that obviously inflates his offensive production. On the other hand, we are looking at a third base position which posted a 72 weighted RC plus in 2015 for the Indians and was clearly the weakest position on the diamond, even though we've targeted center field. So what does a deal for Todd Frazier look like that's suitable to you?
There is probably not a prospect I wouldn't for him. And I am really skeptical that a prospect only package, even a really good one, would actually get Todd Frazier. Because even though he only has 2 years of control left, he carries none of the prospect risk, which is pretty substantial. Like you look at the I know that the Shelby Miller trade was, completely absurd. But at the same time, one probably looked at Dansby Swanson as something of a throw-in with Enciarte, because Enciarte and Shelby Miller are pretty similar. So the concept of trading only prospects for Todd Frazier seems like that wouldn't happen, because I think the prospects as trade currency might get overvalued a little bit, particularly when it comes to well above average players like Todd Frazier. So if we were to try to construct a prospect trade, it would be, I don't know, there might be an argument to throw in Zimmer and Frazier as the only thing that Cincinnati would accept.
Interesting. No, I think the Cincinnati rebuild and rebuilds in general are interesting to me in that, especially for Cincinnati, which is not a small market, but it's one that has to operate under market constraints and probably is a bottom 15 market at the very least. They have this very large contract with Joey Votto, which they aren't going to escape. And I think, to me, one of the most sort of successful models is one which has a 3 or 4 year kind of bottom out, where the bottom is very low. And so one of the problems with acquiring young, cost controllable big league talent is it can affect the bottom out process. The other one is timing. I think the Braves are doing something really interesting in that they're acquiring all these prospects, but they're also preparing for the timing aspect of it. The timing being acquiring sort of young cost controlled big league talent and young cost control and young prospects at the same time can kind of create this awkward timing where you're competent but you don't reach something above competency at a necessary time. Is it right that maybe the Reds should be in a bottom out stage where acquiring big league talent isn't the best incentive, whereas acquiring high valued prospect assets is? Or is that an absurd notion? Should you always just be looking for cost control big league talent as a priority over prospect value?
No, I think you make a pretty good argument there that they should prioritize prospects. At the same time, there is a little bit of a question as to what fair market value would be if someone were solely paying in prospects. Because, I imagine that there are a bunch of teams looking for a third baseman out there. And if any of them wanted to get Todd Frazier and were only gunning for prospects, then you could get quite a haul for them. And so I don't know if we should be looking at. I don't know if we should get our hopes up that only one of Frazier or Zimmer would actually get it done, because we might be able to construct that plus Sheffield / Clevenger or whatever. But Todd Frazier is really good, and he has actual positive value, even if it's a pretty short-term value. So from the Reds' perspective, I can definitely see why they would want to acquire a prospect. From the Reds' perspective, again, though, you need quite a lot in order to actually give up Todd Frazier. And it's not as though the 2016 Reds look to be terrible. The Zips projections were thrown out yesterday, and they look pretty average. Like, not bad average, just like 81 wins-ish for 2016. And given that Votto is still good, there's an argument to be made they could still build around him right now and make a, I don't know, fringe wildcard run because the NL Central is a nightmare. But yes, in the long term, I think trading for prospects is probably a good idea. But Votto's contract runs through 2023, so it's still going to be pretty rough.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm intrigued. I think the next question is, if you don't think it can be a prospect-centric deal, can you build a deal that doesn't include one of the top three
Yes.
starters
None
that
of the
has
top.
big league talent?
Yeah, the sort of valuation process that I use is very heavily centered around the major league players. I definitely prioritize floor over ceiling personally. The Reds might not. I don't know. But none of those top three, would fetch only Todd Frazier. They would get substantially more than that because they are all probably better than Todd Frazier, and they are all definitely controlled for a longer amount of time. So I think if you wanted to throw in Frazier and like Jose Ramirez, that could work, because Ramirez is good and he's a serviceable major leaguer. That's valuable. Plus, when combined with the ceiling of whatever prospects you want to throw in, like Frazier and Naquin, then that could work. It could be the simulacrum of a deal, not necessarily a deal itself.
Yeah, I think Frazier's really interesting to me in terms of he obviously offers for the Indians what they need in terms of financial cost, which is highly limited. He offers an upgrade to a position that is empty. He offers a additional depth to the lineup that looks really fantastic if you put it on paper, I think. In terms of, I think there's this, I don't know, it's a foolish thing, but offense is something that is in some ways cumulative in its effects, and when you add depth at the top with him and can sort of sandwich these guys, there's a lot of value to that. On the other hand, we have the issue of ultimately Frazier has some challenges in evaluating his value, correct? We're looking at someone who is hitting in one of the three most favorable parks for right-handed hitters and would be moving to one of the five least favorable. And he thrives on power, specifically home run production over the past couple of years have been really essential to his production. We're going to see that sort of taper off, I'm assuming, in Cleveland, which curves his value. So how does that? It's hard to make the sale as the Indians, correct, that we're not trading for last year's Todd Frazier. We're trading for 3.5 WAR Todd Frazier, not roughly 5 WAR Frazier.
Well, I think that if the Reds don't agree to that particular framework, then they are probably not going to get a deal done, because if anybody's trying to trade for what was it, 5-WAR Todd Frazier, they are not going to get anyone buying that because people who are trading for Todd Frazier are not going to expect 5 wins out of Todd Frazier. It's just how it's going to work. So if Cincinnati isn't willing to deal, then they're not willing to deal. It's like the Jose Fernandez trade. Yeah, give us Seager and Urias, and I don't know, Jock Peterson, maybe Kershaw, whatever. If they don't want to deal, then they don't want to deal. But if Cincinnati is realistic and is expecting like 3.5 win Todd Frazier, which is really good, then they might be. I think that we can probably get a deal done. And as for the actual level of adjustment that makes, it's not necessary. It's not even though that Todd Frazier has put up any sort of bad park adjusted line. I know that he is, he has more home runs than he would hit in Progressive Field, but that's accounted for to some extent in the league and park adjusted lines. So would it have any particular impact? Would it have any more impact on Frazier than the park adjusted lines would suggest? Maybe. But the alternative to that is building a left-handed only lineup, which, while bold, is probably not going to happen. So I'm not unduly worried about the park shift. A little bit, but not too much.
I think we have this. I don't know. We have a pretty significant obsession with poking holes in Frazier when we're talking about bringing him to Cleveland, which the significant, third base is interesting because you'd be bringing essentially a top 5 to 7 third baseman in. He's a very good defender as well, which is important to note. So he's a solid offensive player. Even a league average offensive player with above average defense at third is someone who's supremely valuable. And the marginal value improvement at third is huge because of how poor it was last year. I guess if we're going to discuss third as a black hole, it's probably reasonable to at least expand on our criticisms and concerns about Mr. Urshela.
Yes. I think for Urshela, there is one concern, and that is BABIP. His defense is excellent. He is an excellent defender. He has perfectly fine power, good strikeout rates, bad walk rates. Those two balance each other out for the most part. It's the BABIP. And his minor league BABIP was something like 290-ish. Or at least that's what it was before the year. I don't know what it was, including this year's minor league BABIP. But his major league BABIP, while worse than one would expect, was still not great. So while there's a ton of noise when it comes to single season BABIP, this isn't a 1-year problem for Urshela. It's a many-year problem for Urshela, and I don't know if you can expect him to hit any more than like a 270 BABIP in the majors. That's being maybe a little bit aggressive in the projection. So Urshela's problem isn't his power. It's not his strikeout rate. It's not his walk rate. It is BABIP, and I don't know if you can expect that to rebound to anything like a league average level.
Yeah, so why don't we kind of talk about the implications of if we were going to say aggressively that 270 is sort of his baseline BABIP moving forward, with obvious variation on both sides. Mm-hmm. Kind of the implications of what a 270 BABIP is, because I think a lot of times we talk about BABIP, that is batting average on balls in play, for those who don't understand it and are listening, but a lot of times we talk about it as this separate thing without the implications that it has for the overall offensive line, in that it's very central to the overall offensive line. And I suppose the implication is that the sort of ceiling for him batting average wise created by a 270 BABIP is one that's including a strikeout rate. It's going to be something towards 240. Is that a fair assumption?
Yep.
250.
Super projection has 242 batting average and 284 on base percentage for 2016. So that's a little brutal.
So that's the sort of implication. And then if he had another carrying tool offensively or average tool, be it power or batting average, not batting average, or on base percentage, essentially walk rate, that's sort of cover up this issue. But it seems like he just has an overall quality of contact issue, which bears itself out in his power and in the BABIP. So I think it's really hard to be optimistic about his offensive profile going forward, though so many are, and so many make you feel guilty if you aren't. I think that is a challenging thing to do without expecting sort of wholesale changes in terms of maybe mechanical changes or wholesale offensive changes. And once you get to basing expectations on sort of substantive mechanical changes, your expectations are then in a sort of gray area that likely will not occur. I guess with that in mind, kind of want to move to other potential deals the Indians could make. I think the really obvious one at this point, the one that we've been waiting out since July, other than Marcelo Ozuna, which is a shout out to them. But the deal which we've been waiting on, other than that, is one with the Chicago Cubs. The centerpiece would be likely Salazar at this point, with the other opposing centerpiece for the Cubs of Chicago to be likely Jorge Soler.
I think Soler.
Is there any chance the Indians can get Soler and Baez in that deal?
Is there that is very tempting, because I can't see that as being obviously slanted one way or another. Like if we're talking about Salazar for like Schwarber and one of those two, then no, that's not happening. But both of them have severe enough problems that seems completely plausible. And as to whether or not that's desirable, I would say it's probably not, because that would displace guild patron Walters, and I don't want that. However, you are buying a heck of a lot of ceiling. Both of those two are 22, which is what, 3-4 years in Salazar. They're also position players, which, although they do have substantial risk in the current offensive profiles that they have, the very fact that they're position players makes them less risky than pitchers, all else equal. And all else isn't equal, but that's why it's 2 for 1. So converting some of that risk from injury risk, the sort of Tommy John plus generic pitcher injury risk, into just risk with the bat is tempting. That's very tempting.
So I don't wish to act as if the Indians have someone who is the equivalency of Salazar who could step into the rotation. I would submit that the sort of 6, 7, 8 depth is very substantive. Ultimately, I think one of the really interesting things to me about the Indians long term and for this offseason is whether TJ House is healthy. I think people forget the sort of upside that House offers, and the sort of quality in his arsenal, and in terms of inducing ground balls. But let's return to that in a minute. But I think you touched on something really essential to Salazar's risk, and I am very much I am in love with Salazar. There's no question. I've published a lot about him. I think he's an absurd talent. He has 2 absolutely plus offerings. The changeup / split finger is an absurd offering. But I guess we're dealing with someone who has had significant arm surgery. He's never gone over 180 innings in the big leagues. And anyone who is throwing a baseball for a living has more injury risk than someone who is catching the ball for a living. So I guess that's essential. So let's talk about what would happen if they acquire Soler and Baez. And
It's
I guess also approximate the odds of that possibility, because we've said that it would be relatively fair. Do you think the chance of bringing both of them in one deal is above 50%?
my guess. Let's see. If the Cubs were willing to, if this is a situation that we can call plausible, then I think that might be the case. I think yes, the Cubs might offer more than 50%, but then the question from the Indians' perspective becomes, as you said, what is the fit? Where do Soler and Baez go? And I really do not want Soler touching center field, but at the same time, we're still looking at Abraham Almonte in center field, and then we've pretty much spent the only currency that we have in order to actually improve center field. So there's definitely a bit of a tricky aspect to that because what we'd be doing essentially would be displacing Chisenhall for the time being. And while that probably does not make it pose too much of a problem in itself, that also, makes a sort of obsolete. I don't know if it's the optimal use of resources. So on one hand, the risk does favor the trade, but on the other hand, the existing needs don't so much, because we would have Soler in right field, we would have probably Baez at third, which I don't know if that's going to happen, but whatever. We're spitballing anyway. And then we just have Chisenhall and Cowgill floating somewhere in the ether. Chisenhall is good, but I don't know if he has the bat to DH. And additionally, where precisely? So the fit is a little bit confusing because Chisenhall is not great, nor is he particularly bad. He's average-ish, maybe a little bit below, and I don't know if we can afford to be displacing, 1.5 win players, given that center field and third base are both colossal wrecks. So,
okay. So I guess follow-up question to this.
Sure.
Is there any reason Soler could not start out in left field for
with
the
Brantley
first
thing.
half of the season?
Yeah.
And then Brantley remains as a DH for a substantive portion of the season.
See, I like that. I do like that because Brantley recovering from the injury, and from a 2016 perspective, that makes a ton of sense. It requires a little bit of faith in Soler's bat, but healthy Brantley in left field was not great, and injured Brantley is probably not going to be much better. So as a DH, that's an interesting suggestion, and I think that would be an excellent fit if you wanted to approach it from that perspective, because DHing Brantley is not something that I'd be all that opposed to. He can go into the outfield at times, but definitely to start, probably he'll be the primary DH, which is fine by me. So that certainly takes care of the depth issue and whether or not they'd actually be replacing replacement level players. Answer, probably. So interesting.
My one concern with that is in late August, when Brantley decides that he wants to be on the field again. And Soler has performed adequately in left, assuming that he's performed well and his bat is playing up as expected, which is a reasonable assumption. There's a lot of quality of contact to kind of support that notion long term.
Yep.
Fear for me is that this is a team and a manager that has run Mike Aviles out in center. And while the Indians have a lot of long-term financial money wrapped up in Brantley, I'm slightly concerned as well with sort of his good-to-go attitude, which is a very positive thing, that They would then insert Brantley in center, and we would
Okay.
have a Chisenhall, Brantley, Soler alignment. So I guess my concern with a Soler acquisition is that it makes sense to me in the short term and also in the long term, because I think that I really buy into that bat
Hmm.
being productive. On the other hand, the outfield fit seems pretty poor to
Oh yeah.
me. And what happens? I think essentially, if you do it in the long term, you're committing yourself to saying Brantley or Soler is a full-time DH.
Yeah, which I'm kind of fine with. Having one of those
Or
two
I'm sorry.
as DH is fine because they have not to this point shown themselves to be outstanding fielders, so not a huge loss. But what were you saying?
What are your thoughts on? I think it's been discussed before around the fringes of Indians Twitter society. Brantley, first baseman, long term, post Santana world.
Uh, well, the post Santana world is 2018, and then Brantley leaves. So,
That's true.
to what extent that's long term may not be realistic. Uh,
That's fair.
uh, Now, if one wanted to go with the first base DH platoon of, or not platoon, but some combination of those two between Brantley DHing and Santana playing first, and then rotating Brantley out to left field or, God forbid, center field, and while Santana is DHing. That seems doable because we have a problem at one of those. At first base or DH, we're going to have a problem. There's no way of getting around that because at this point we have Chris Johnson probably DHing as the default. Uh, can we just release him? Is that okay? Can we do that, please?
Please.
Please. Because my real concern is that he is going to be DHing or he is going to be playing somewhere else and will not just be left on the bench to sit there. Because if he's not released, then I'm worried that Francona is going to play him. And that would be the worst possible thing, I think.
One of the scariest things is when Johnson is discussed by the organization and people who comment on the organization as someone with a sort of flexibility or versatility. And the reality is that at every position which he is supposedly flexible, he is an atrocious defender. And the conversation about Johnson potentially playing right field is nightmarish.
I mean, you gotta, to be fair, you gotta commend the man on his flexibility. He can post negative WAR at DH. He can post negative WAR at third base, left field, shortstop. Who knows? Wherever he plays, he will give you the same results, and I think that's admirable. I think he does a pretty good job out there.
Okay. Okay. Returning to this Cubs venture.
Yeah.
Javi Baez.
Yeah.
Do we? There is a lot of risk with that bat, and Soler is interesting to me as someone who's much greater than a lotto ticket. I think that there is something really substantive there. Obviously, projecting from year to year is impossible, and what will come developmentally. But I think we have the peripheral indicators to say Soler's bat is of a certain quality that I think it'll be productive. Baez, we have someone who a 30% strikeout rate is not an unreasonable expectation. We haven't really found an adequate spot for him defensively. Perhaps third. Is that a good fit? Could he defend that position at average to above average?
Let's see. He came through the system as a shortstop. Such a thing is not unprecedented, but I have no idea whether that would actually work. It's plausible to think that it could work, but I have no idea. But it's interesting because Javi Baez appears to be the sort of batting Danny Salazar. I think that Soler is like that to some extent as well, where he has high strikeout rate, low walk rate, and really high isolated power. So he He appears to be the batting Danny Salazar, which is generally bad, but also his power is pretty impressive, and he appears to be possibly a competent hitter. And the reason I say that is because his minor league track record. I know that putting too much stock in minor league numbers is dangerous, but when you look at it, it was really only his 2014 that was atrocious, because his 2015 was really not bad at all for a guy who could hypothetically play shortstop. He's 22. 22-year-olds don't generally hit all that well. I don't know to what extent we can expect the plate discipline to improve. Probably not a ton. But at the same time, this is a guy who, in 2013 as a 20-year-old hit well above average, who this year in AAA hit also well above average. And while a fair amount of that was buoyed by the BABIP, it's not as though he's had a bad track record for BABIP. He appears like he could probably approximate major league average when it comes to BABIP, or maybe even exceed it. So those two, combined with the awful plate discipline numbers, seem like they could balance each other out. I have some amount of faith in Javi Baez, and I think that even though he has proven himself very inconsistent in the past, he's also 22, and so that, I think, probably can't really be emphasized too much.
I think one of the really interesting things, if we're going to rely, I think at the very least, even his major league production in 2015 in a small sample is interesting. He got a bunch of reps at third. Defensive ratings are really crazy, but he's someone who, if you marry the +4 DRS in a 60 inning sample, which is tiny, absolutely tiny, but if you marry that with former shortstop who's very athletic and has kind of received rave reviews about his athleticism, then we kind of have a sale where, hey, he can probably play league average defense at third. I think that's not an unreasonable expectation. The bat, I guess the bat is really interesting to me in terms of, what the power is generated. But is this, it seems like a projection of like 1.5 at third is not wholly unreasonable. It would be a probably substantive upgrade over last season's production. It's a position that, while it wouldn't be above average, it would be at least stable, and then you have whatever Soler provides. That deal makes a lot of sense to me in terms of both the transition of risk and player fit. That one probably makes the most sense to me of at most we've talked about.
Yeah.
Another question.
Yes.
Schwarber.
Yeah. I don't know.
Is there any possibility? And is he someone who at this point is a commodity that we possibly overvalue because there is no existing position for him other than DH? Likely he finished the American League.
I mean, Schwarber was playing the outfield at some point, and like he has the body of a DH, but he's also he looks like a DH, but also hasn't. Again, depending on whether you actually trust the numbers, hasn't really been atrocious in the outfield either, which is very strange. But at the same time, what one perceives versus what one actually produces in the outfield, they are occasionally pretty dissonant. And while you could easily criticize the defensive ratings for being unstable and for being estimates and being a complete joke in half a sample size or in half a season, which is all completely fair, Schwarber, I think, might be able to man the corner outfield, which we have accepted Brantley in. So, we've already accepted that deadweight loss. As for whether or not he's overrated, that's interesting because he was really good when he was originally called up, but he ended the season with something like 124 WRC plus, which is good, but it's not this thing that we are like, oh my goodness, he is clearly so much better than everyone else. He is not Chris Bryant. He is not Chris Bryant, and as a result, like I think the mythos of Kyle Schwarber has kind of eclipsed Kyle Schwarber, the ball player. He's going to be a good player going forward. Is he going to be the sort of untouchable god that is clearly all that much better than Baez? I don't know.
Yeah, I think this is the really interesting trade-off. I also think some of the mythos is built by sort of you know playoff production of note,
Yeah,
and I think often we get swept up in that, and that's foolish. I think to me one of the scary things would be, and I am sure that Chris Antonetti is a man much smarter than I am, so I doubt this occurs. But to me, I would actually prefer a Soler Baez acquisition to a Schwarber and other small part. I don't think that you get Schwarber plus either of these guys.
right.
I think that you get Soler plus Baez. That to me makes more sense. I think that there's obvious risk, but I think it potentially solves two positions with quality talent and young talent that is controllable, which possibly kind of changes the window. You would have a core, a secondary core almost of Lindor, Soler, Baez, with these Zimmer and Frazier types possibly falling. So I think not that they can be relied upon, but I think that it also creates an interesting sort of window extension or development when looking at this team.
Also, to correct myself, it was 131 was his uh, weighted line. So I correct myself. I was not correct. That said, yeah, I would definitely agree that you're going to trade Salazar or Carrasco if you can do one of two things: uh, fill one hole with an incredible talent, or fill several with above average talents. Soler Baez absolutely does the latter. To do the former, you'd probably need, I don't know, maybe a little like Puig-ish, maybe a little bit more. I don't know. Uh, I don't know. Want to try to throw together a Machado trade? Sure, let's go. Uh, Kidding.
I think the next conversation, which is required, is the team from Houston. Um, Not only because the Indians have been rumored to have had conversations, although I don't know what conversations mean anymore. I think that teams text Chris Antonetti and we're like, hey, you have 3 fireballers. And he's like, yes, I do. And then they offer something that is atrocious, like Brett Oberholzer for one of them. And Chris says no, and the conversation is over.
Yeah.
However, they have had conversations. George Springer is an enticing player. And there is a friend of the guild,
Oh yes.
young young Tyler White, young
Young
White.
Tyler. Yes. Young Tyler White. He has in 2015. Young Mr. Tyler White uh, I believe, was ranked only the 27th prospect in the Astros system, which does not concern me in the least because that's the entire point of the guild. I think is to prioritize minor league numbers over prospect pedigree, which kind of invalidates the membership of Javi Baez, but he is now post prospecty enough that we can actually include Javier Baez in the group that the guild is appreciating. So we are fine with that. We are also fine with venerating Tyler White. And the reason for this is that he has played the corner infield probably not all that great. I have no idea what his defense looks like. But for the most part, he played either first base or DH in AAA in 2015. So this is the sort of person you don't immediately think is all that good, but then you look at his minor league stat lines, and for the most part, his Texas League, he's in the minors for a Texas team, so offensive run environments. But there's only been one point in his minor league career where he's posted a minor league WOBA lower than 390, which is still probably like a 150 or 150 adjusted overall for his minor league career. And yes, a lot of it is BABIP and walk oriented, which is pretty unstable, but at the same time, he's been really good at it. So couple that with clear centerpiece George Springer, and that's a deal that I think is pretty interesting. I also don't know why people aren't talking about Tyler White more, aside from he has a no prospect pedigree, which is, all right, I guess.
Tyler White appears to be something that is the sort of hopeful product of Yandy Diaz. He has this sort of walk dominant skill, except White has actually produced the power, which is certainly interesting. How much do you think he would be worth to, like, what sort of piece would you trade off if you were doing a small sort of ancillary Tyler White targeting side deal?
I think, assuming that the Astros view him, from the same perspective I do. From the Indians' perspective, I think, Yandy is a pretty reasonable trade-off, because even though Yandy is, I like Yandy, and that's one of the reasons why I think, while their skill sets are still pretty different, in that I think Yandy has, I think Yandy's glove is better than Tyler White's glove. This is probably compensated from the fact that both fringe prospects, of the two fringe prospects, rather, Tyler White's bat has consistently been better. He does not have incredible power, but he has probably at least plus, maybe major league average power, and same with the BABIP. His plate discipline is probably going to be above average. His strikeout rate probably below average, maybe average. I don't know. And so, he appears like he could be a pretty solid average player. I don't know.
Interesting. I wish you could sort of. I wish it would be interesting to see if they could pry someone like this away. It really is surprising, having never glanced at Mr. White's production before, how productive he is and how little he has been discussed.
Like I said,
though pedigree is weighed so heavily in these conversations, and pedigree is defined as financial bonus and draft selection slot, which is generally foolish, and is why Tyler Naquin, substantive major leaguer, is still a conversation.
I don't know. I make
the sale. Make a sale for Tyler Naquin. I think the sale you have to make correct is that the defense is above average, substantively, correct?
I think that would be part of the argument. I also don't know if his like the minor league numbers that interest me, being BABIP, being power, being strikeout and walk, or mostly just strikeout actually. He is probably maybe a little bit below average player. You look at his BABIPs and you understand that, okay, this is probably why he was an above average hitter, in that he slashed something like, he had something like a 360-ish BABIP between AA, AAA last year. So to think that he'll be able to carry that over to the majors is both foolish and also why one would think he's an above average hitter. I do not. I think he's probably just a tick below average, but that's basically it. I think that he is a tick below average, and then that offense, and then his defense, which has been somewhat highly regarded. I don't totally know. You might be able to speak to it better than I. Would probably be able to carry a slightly below average bat, and that's what I think he is, because his minor league BABIPs are, excellent for the most part. They are reasonable enough to think that he'd be able to slash maybe an above average line at the major league level. His power probably is not going to be there. I think that if one were to say that his AAA power were a mirage, I wouldn't be able to argue with that. But it's not as though his strikeout to walk ratio has been atrocious, and he appears to be a new player, like ever since the start of 2014. And while the skepticism surrounding Naquin might have been merited before 2013 or before 2014, he's I can't speak to development, and in terms of actual eye test evaluations of these players, I'm not going to make any pretense to that. When I say looks like, I'm merely going by the sort of thing that I analyze. But his BABIPs are good enough, his power adequate enough, and also his strikeout to walk ratio adequate enough that I could probably see him as, a perfectly average major leaguer. Maybe not perfectly average. That might be overselling his offense a little bit and overselling his defense as well. But it's not that difficult to make the argument, I don't think. Where do you take issue with that?
No, I don't know if I do. I think that I was someone who was highly tentative in the first year and a half, and perhaps that has biased me in the long term. I think the interesting part is, and very strong case you make is, these minor league BABIPs are something that are actually very impressive, and when married with the best tool that he was drafted for, well, we've started to discuss defense as sort of a carrying tool, and the arm itself. Naquin was drafted out of college as what was known as the most sort of polished contact quality bat in that draft. That was the selling tool. And so I suppose with that information married to the minor league BABIPs, it becomes easier to buy into the concept that he is someone who has a lot of contact authority and contact quality and speed, which can also buoy his BABIP, to the point of the fact that perhaps 100 weighted RC plus is not an unreasonable projection, or perhaps 95. And that married with average defense is, that's a 2-WAR player. So there is a point at which I have to recalibrate my expectations of Tyler Naquin, though frustrated as I was.
And my own expectations of Tyler Naquin, not to carry the Naquin train too long, is that I don't see him as substantially different than Abraham Almonte, which might be an indictment of the latter, might be support of the former, who knows. But if one were to try to convince me that the two put up substantially different numbers under the circumstances, then I would say that they might be placing a little bit too much credence on late 2015 Abraham Almonte. But, this front office is no stranger to sorcery, apparently, with Jan Gomes. So, whatever.
Okay, so let's play along as if we've sort of solved the Indians' problems here via the Soler deal. Let's say that the Salazar deal goes through. Okay, so Salazar's gone. Baez is the starting third baseman. Soler is starting in left. When Brantley returns, he's predominantly a DH.
Subjunctive granted.
Brantley as a DH first actually adds nice value because he could play center occasionally. He could play left occasionally. It removes the point for Chris Johnson. So then we would more easily than now, cut Mr. Johnson. So then what happens? So then you have bench space, correct? So would a Naquin Almonte platoon make pretty strong sense and actually be relatively productive in center?
I buy that. I do. Like Almonte's, I think it was Bretz who posted this, Matt Bretz, and his basic point was that Almonte against left, was it against left? No.
Assume against right-handed pitching.
Yeah. So Naquin would be hitting against right-handed pitching. I buy that. I just don't know if Almonte is strong enough from the right side to actually make that platoon work, because he is not. Or I don't know if he's been historically all that good against right-handed pitching. I would. So my initial concern stemmed from the fact that I mixed up his right-handed and left-handed splits, Abraham Almonte's, and let me double check this. Yes, against lefties, he has a career 66 WRC plus, mostly buoyed by bad power and a bad walk rate, and so I think it might be either Almonte or Naquin as the strong side of the platoon. I don't know if I want either of them hitting against lefties. So
Perfect.
yeah, no, our platoons don't line up at all, and it's great.
I think ultimately that would be the only. I do enjoy the idea of Brantley as DH. I think if you bring in Soler and Baez and they perform competently, you've essentially solved two positions, which is offsetting Brantley's production to DH rather than left, but Soler essentially solves DH by playing left. And the other solution being Baez upgrading third, which creates a team with a few league average players, perhaps in Baez, maybe Soler, and Chisenhall. And then you can rely on your studs, Kipnis, Gomes, Lindor, Brantley, to sort of anchor the offense and the production as a whole. And then you retain two potential Cy Young Award winners and a rotation with sort of substantive depth.
Yes.
They're not elite. That to me seems slightly more exciting than this current version of the Indians. Is that reasonable? Is that unreasonable?
No, because they are still that still has them at a $66 million payroll. That doesn't functionally change their payroll all that much. So it's very interesting. That I also wonder whether or not Chicago. I understand the concept of them dealing from depth, but I'm definitely waffling on whether or not they would actually make that trade. Regardless, given that particular subjunctive, that's a reasonably strong team.
So I guess I'm assuming that the Indians' win projections are going to be somewhere around 85 once again in 2016. Last year they won 81, but base runs had them at 89, correct?
Yes, I think that's correct.
I believe third order winning percentage from Baseball Prospectus had them in the 90s with what is, I believe, the best or the second best record in the AL. And these are sort of tools that are used to strip the randomness, the punishing randomness that is baseball. And,
yes.
And whether all of its randomness is another conversation, I suppose. Is there another way? All right, first let's have the conversation that is necessary to say maybe we shouldn't upgrade this team, or maybe not upgrading this team is not a significant. Okay, maybe upgrading this team is not as imperative as frustrated Winter Meetings Twitter would like it to be.
Yeah, so I still have the Indians as I still think the Indians are probably the best team in the AL Central right now. Part of that is the fact that the Royals are likely going to lose, or almost certainly going to lose, two of Zobrist, Cueto, and Gordon. Given the fact that they won the World Series, they might be able to retain Gordon, but even if we grant that, it still doesn't change all that much. So I don't know whether they like this. There's still something of an outside shot at the wild card, and also the favorite for the AL Central. It's not to say that they are likely going to win the AL Central, as we know. Odds are odds, and getting Justin Upton would not push us from 45% to 100%, hypothetically. But I still think that the Indians have to be the favorites. Let's make the argument for Detroit. It's that JD Martinez is going to continue to be elite. I buy that. Miguel Cabrera is going to be elite. All right. Let's see, what else do we have to grant? Jordan Zimmerman is going to bounce back completely. Justin Verlander is going to bounce back completely. And also that the that the island of misfit toys called their replacement level is going to be more than replacement level. So Detroit is very much in that strange iffy land. By iffy, I mean not good. So then that gives us the White Sox, who no, and then the Royals, who won the World Series. Congratulations, but are also losing a substantial amount, and were not fantastic by third order or context neutral stats. There's some fair argument, I guess, to be made that Wade Davis, that the elite back end of the bullpen that they had, plus their contact ability, gave them the ability to exceed it by a little bit, but by the extent that they did is still kind of hard to believe. And these are teams that probably can't improve a ton for next year. I sent you the payroll numbers about how Cleveland's sitting at 65. There's no other team in the AL Central that has less than 100 million committed already for 2016. Most of the teams are sitting at 100, just over 100, 104 for the Twins and the White Sox, 106 for the Royals without any of the other three, and then 164 for Detroit. But Illich is Caligula, so that doesn't matter all that much. So the Royals could improve. I could definitely see them getting Gordon, but even so, it would be worst case scenario for the Indians. It would be basically, even odds for both Cleveland and the Royals. They're certainly not the the purported need to do stuff, I think, is probably from those who may be looking a little bit too much at last year, and who may be looking at who are probably understating the odds that the Indians had last year, and also overstating the impact of getting to 70%, because as we saw from the Nationals, who had an 80% chance to win the division going into the year, that doesn't always work out, does it? So mortgaging the future for 2016 does help your chances, but it helps it in a very finite quantity, and the possibility for failure does not leave. So improving in 2016, definitely good. Is it absolutely necessary? Maybe not, but at the same time, I would want that extra $20 million that they would have spent in 2016 to then go to 2017, 18, 19, because there's no real rationale for undershooting your baseline. It doesn't help. And so they probably should do something about DH, but beyond that, there's not a massive need within the context of the AL Central. This is not one of the best teams in the AL, but nor do they need to be, I don't think, to win the AL Central.
Mm-hmm. I think, correct me if I'm wrong. This is assumption number one. I'm assuming with the wild card odds and the division odds, unless Kansas City acquires something really substantive, I'm assuming we're going to enter 2016 with the Indians' playoff odds somewhere around 50 to 55%. Is that a relatively fair assumption?
Yeah, probably.
So I think, what really builds, I think what's really ultimately going to shift the expectancy substantively is interesting to me. I've heard. I think Upton's a really interesting toss around. So
Yeah.
we'll close with a slight conversation about Upton. Reasonable contract for him would be 5 and 100. Is that a reasonable suggestion as to money that he could receive? Perhaps
Then
120 maybe.
yeah, I think that because he's a slight downgrade on Cespedes. I wouldn't say a huge one, but definitely something tangible there between him and Cespedes. Yeah, 120 seems about right. I don't know whether it's 5 or 6. It doesn't matter all that much. Amount committed is amount committed, and it's not as though he's going to produce a ton 6 years from now. So that seems like a reasonable thing. Now, if it's a question of whether the Indians can afford to make that move, I also don't really. He would make the team better because center field it's a problem. I don't know if there's a way around that. And so in filling probably one of the 2 biggest holes on the team, maybe 3, depending on whether you count DH, that would make the team better, and increasing the team's win expectancy by like 2 or 3 wins, depending on whether or not you view Almonte as better than replacement level, then that I think shifts because Cleveland's at a pretty high leverage point on the win curve. I know that the win curve has gotten a little bit out of fashion in the past 2 years, but if there were high leverage parts on the win curve, Cleveland would be at it. So there's a definite benefit to adding a player like Upton in the biggest one of the biggest needs that we have. As to whether or not that would be prudent, like I said, there's no even the big contracts that Cleveland has aren't going to be albatrosses. Probably they are at worst, given the amount of money committed, they are at worst going to be pushes that we will be able to say, hey, you want this contract? And somebody will be like, sure. Do you want this random guy from Single A? And you're like, yeah, sure. That Single A player turns out to be a Cy Young Award winner because Antonetti's a magician. But yeah, even though things for Cleveland, even though a player might not have a particular trade value in Cleveland due to his contract size, that does not mean that to other markets, that player, a player making $15 million and who's worth about 2, maybe 3 wins, doesn't have substantial value elsewhere. So there are very few contracts that Cleveland wouldn't be able to move if that became a problem. So he could be signed. Basically not my money, so it doesn't matter all that much to me.
All right. I think in order to avoid this becoming an unbelievably long listening experience for those who will muddle their way through this, it is best if we wrap this up here.
Oh, yes.
But yeah, thanks so much for doing this. This was a lot of fun. We'll be doing this again soon.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll have something substantive rather than hypothetical to discuss.
Yes.
At the very least. So that is all. This is Mike Hattery from Everybody Hates Cleveland with John Grimm, the Guild DeWalters man, the squire of Guild DeWalters. And we're signing off. Thanks for listening.